Ilhan Omar walked into the Oval Office that afternoon like it was a stage she'd booked months ago, not a room where power gets exercised quietly and paperwork does the heavy lifting. She stood instead of sitting, arms tight, posture set, voice already sharpened for the clip that would live forever on cable news and social feeds. Across the Resolute desk, President Donald Trump didn't rise to match the temperature, didn't flinch, didn't give her the reaction she came to harvest. He watched with that annoying, almost bored half-smile, like a man letting a storm pass because he knows the forecast better than the person yelling at the sky. And in that first minute, the whole thing already felt less like a policy argument and more like a trap built out of silence. Omar opened with contempt and kept going, saying, "Mr. President," the way someone says, "nice car," right before they key it. She framed the meeting as a cheap intimidation play, the kind she believed she'd beaten 100 times. A loud man with a famous name trying to scare a loud woman with a bigger microphone. She tossed in the familiar insults: old, weak, corrupt, obsessed with optics, then widened it into a full moral indictment, the kind that doesn't need footnotes because it's designed to be felt, not litigated. She invoked the cameras that weren't in the room as if they were ghosts who'd protect her anyway. And she spoke like the media ecosystem outside the gates was an armored vehicle she could ride out in. Trump let her talk, which in Washington can be either respect or a countdown timer, and he made it look like neither. The room itself didn't match her script, and she should have noticed it sooner. There were no aides at side tables typing action items, no friendly photo op, no staffer nervously clearing a throat to steer the meeting back to talking points. FBI Director Christopher Wray stood off to the side with thick folders, the kind you don't bring for a vibes-based conversation. DHS Secretary Kristi Noem was there too, with her own stack, and the Secret Service agents by the doors had the stillness of people told in advance this might get ugly in a legal sense, not a physical one. Omar had been told it was an urgent national security matter, and she treated that phrase like a dramatic hook, not a warning label. She'd gotten the summons that morning through Chief of Staff Susie Wiles, formal, brief, and unusually direct. No details, no back and forth, no, "we'll see if the president can squeeze you in," just a time and a demand wrapped in the language of security. In her office, she and her communications team read it the way political people always read things, as message, as motive, as opportunity. Her staff, nervous by instinct, asked if they should probe for more information before she went, because vague is sometimes how Washington spells trouble. Omar waved it off, convinced it was about her statements on Israel and Gaza, convinced it was just another attempt to rattle her and feed conservative media. And she acted like the only risk was failing to make it look good. So she prepared the way performers prepare, not the way defendants prepare. She planned to stand, to interrupt, to land the lines that would sound righteous even if they weren't responsive. She told her team to alert friendly reporters and have cameras ready outside the White House so she could turn an urgent meeting into an instant media moment. She pictured Trump yelling, her staying calm, and the story writing itself in real time. She imagined her millions of followers as a shield, the same way many politicians do right up until a subpoena teaches them what shields don't stop. And if you want the short version of what went wrong, it's that she expected a fight and walked into a file. Meanwhile, across town and behind layers of security, Trump spent the morning with people who don't care about hashtags. In the Situation Room, he sat with Wray, Noem, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, White House counsel Todd Blanche, and a handful of others staring at binders and records arranged like an argument. The table was covered with the kind of material that's meant to survive cross-examination. financial trails, immigration documents, timelines, summaries, and exhibits. Trump looked energized, according to the telling, less like a man bracing for a public debate, and more like a man who believes the paperwork finally caught up to the person he's wanted to corner. He asked for every detail, not because he needed to understand policy, but because he wanted to understand leverage. Wray, in this version of events, laid out how the investigation supposedly began. Treasury flags, unusual transfers, patterns that looked structured to avoid reporting thresholds. It's the sort of detail that sounds technical, until you realize technical is how the government says, "We noticed you." The claim was that Omar had been wiring money overseas in amounts that kept landing just under the number that triggers routine scrutiny, and that those transfers pointed toward a specific recipient in Mogadishu. The alleged recipient was identified as Ahmed Noor, described as a brother-in-law, tied to a money transfer operation that investigators said was harder to trace than traditional banking. And right there you can feel the questions forming. Because when diaspora communities send money home, it's common, it's human, and it's also exactly where suspicion likes to hide. The briefers described that system as hawala, an informal network built on trust and family relationships, fast and opaque by design. They said it's widely used in places where banks don't work the way American banks do, and that the very features that make it useful can also make it attractive for people who want their money to travel without leaving a clean trail. They pointed to an entity they said had been designated by Treasury in 2023, Tawakal Express, as a node that allegedly moved funds in ways connected to extremist groups. They showed surveillance photos, charts, and a flow diagram that traced transfers outward like veins. And even if you treat every claim cautiously, the storytelling is obvious. Structured payments, a designated intermediary, and a destination that makes the public's imagination do the prosecution before the court ever meets. From there, the narrative shifts to intent, and intent is where politics gets messy. The investigators in the briefing, as described, said Omar wasn't some naive tourist in the world of counterterrorism because she served on the House Foreign Affairs Committee and received briefings about East African security threats. They suggested she knew or should have known what a particular network was alleged to be used for, which is the kind of phrase that sounds neutral but lands like an accusation. They claimed they could match phone calls to the timing of transfers, creating the impression of coordination rather than coincidence. They even described audio intercepts in which classified information about U.S. policy shifts was allegedly discussed before it was public, raising the specter of leaks without having to prove a motive beyond recklessness. And the moment you hear that, you understand why Trump didn't need to raise his voice in the Oval Office, because the file does the shouting. Noem's portion of the briefing was framed as a separate track with a different kind of power: immigration law. The claim there wasn't, "We caught you doing something new," but "We think your whole foundation was built on misrepresentation." The alleged discrepancies were dramatic on purpose: identity, family history, statements about a parent, records of overseas travel, because dramatic discrepancies are easier to explain at a podium. The story put forward was that Omar's public biography didn't align with records they said they'd obtained, and that those mismatches were material, meaning they mattered legally to how she entered and naturalized. It leaned hard on the idea that she'd told a compelling refugee story that played well in America, while government documents told a different one. And as always, the question becomes, are those documents definitive? Are they reliable? And who gets to decide before the public decides first? Then came the allegation that turns any political story into a tabloid headline: marriage fraud. The briefing described a marriage record involving Ahmed Noor Saeed Elmi and floated the claim, carefully presented as inference, not a proven fact, that the relationship could have been familial rather than romantic. They acknowledged, at least in the telling, that proving biological relationship would require DNA, and that you don't normally get to compel DNA tests from elected officials like you're running a daytime courtroom show. But they argued the pattern: timing, paperwork, later divorce, later remarriage, looked like the kind of scheme immigration investigators are trained to spot. In politics, looked like is often enough to stain, even when is remains unproven. And that's why this kind of allegation is so powerful. It forces the accused to disprove a narrative that can survive without proof in the public mind. Todd Blanche, the White House counsel in this telling, framed the legal pathway as denaturalization, a civil process with a lower burden of proof than criminal prosecution. He leaned on the idea that if citizenship was obtained through fraud or material misrepresentation, it can be revoked, and that the government doesn't have to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, the way it would in a criminal trial. That difference matters, because it changes the posture from convince a jury to persuade a judge, and it changes the timeline from one explosive day to a long grind of filings and hearings. The briefing also acknowledged the political reality. Expulsion from Congress requires a 2/3 vote, which is hard until it suddenly isn't. And the plan they described sounded less like a search for truth and more like an offer designed to corner her, leave quietly, or get dragged through a public process where the government controls the drip of evidence. By the time Omar arrived at the White House, she didn't know any of that, at least not in the story as it's presented. She rode in rehearsing moral arguments and punchy insults, not thinking about structured transfers or passport stamps. She walked down the West Wing hallway with her head high, expecting a confrontation she could frame as courage. When the door opened and she saw Ray and Noam standing there with folders, she felt the first hint that the scene didn't match the script. But once you commit to a performance, it's hard to stop mid-line without looking scared. And politicians fear looking scared more than they fear being wrong. So she went on. She called Trump a threat, accused him of authoritarian instincts, mocked his age and his alleged chaos, and leaned into the language that wins applause on her side of the aisle. She invoked immigration, Muslims, moral failure, topics that reliably trigger heat, because heat is what makes the clip. Trump didn't meet her heat. He sat there and let it burn itself out, which is how you make someone feel like they're yelling into a void. When she refused to sit, he didn't debate the symbolism, he issued a command. And the coldness of that command, calm, direct, unembellished, was the first thing that made her hesitate. "Sit down," he said, and he didn't say it like a host offering a guest a chair. He said it like someone telling you the next words are going to matter, and you're going to want both hands free when they land. Omar sat because the room suddenly felt less like a forum and more like a proceeding. Trump leaned forward, dropped the half-smile, and made it clear he wasn't there to argue about Gaza tweets. He framed it as something else entirely. A national security problem with her name on it, a case file, an investigation, and a decision he claimed he'd made that morning. And that's when the fight stopped being about who could talk louder and started being about who had the paperwork. Trump, in this telling, pushed a thick folder across the desk and said the quiet part out loud. He didn't care about her rhetoric. He cared about leverage. He claimed the FBI had been investigating her for months, and he presented it as a done deal rather than a question. He framed her alleged transfers as money that ended up in the hands of bad actors, and he framed her immigration history as suspect enough to put her citizenship at risk. And he offered a choice that didn't feel like a choice: resign and leave quietly, or face public exposure and a long legal grind. The genius of that offer, politically, is that either outcome makes him look like the man who cleaned it up, while her options both look like retreat. Ray then stepped into the role of the calm professional who doesn't argue, he documents. He reportedly laid bank records and wire confirmations on the desk like exhibits in a training video, pointing to amounts, dates, and repetition. He described the alleged recipient and the alleged network, and he framed it as, sending money to family isn't illegal, but we followed where it went, which is the kind of sentence meant to sound fair even as it tightens the noose. He described the government's designation process, watch lists, sanctions, intelligence, without revealing sources, which is how these briefings always work. Enough to scare, not enough to let you contest the foundation. And he framed Omar's committee role as the reason she couldn't plausibly claim ignorance, which is the most devastating form of "you should have known." Noam followed with immigration records, travel history, and a storyline built on contradiction. She described alleged documentation showing a living mother abroad, despite public statements that implied otherwise, and she framed repeated visits as proof of knowledge rather than nuance. She described alleged birth records and school documents that used different surnames, and she implied identity manipulation without having to prove why. She brought up marriage paperwork and suggested a motive tied to immigration status, using the phrase pattern the way prosecutors do when they don't need a confession. At each step, the careful move was to present it as a set of inconsistencies that raise serious questions, which sounds safer than outright accusing while still planting the idea that something is rotten. And once those ideas are planted, they don't need to be proven to do political damage. They only need to be plausible enough to keep people watching. A third voice in the room, described as a career intelligence official, presented intercept-style claims about communications with foreign officials. The framing was that the government had a warrant, that monitoring was lawful, and that the content was concerning, which is how you tell the public a lot without proving much. They described calls that allegedly discussed U.S. policy timelines before they were public, and they framed that as disclosure of sensitive information. They described language choices, we and they, as evidence of divided loyalties, which is the kind of interpretive argument that can sound persuasive or paranoid depending on who's listening. Omar, in this telling, protested that she's allowed to speak to foreign officials as part of oversight, which is true in general, and that religion-based suspicion is unfair, which also resonates. But the briefing's answer was simple. The concern wasn't identity, it was conduct, and conduct is where law and politics overlap in the most brutal way. After the evidence presentation, Trump returned to the center like a director stepping back into frame once the supporting cast has set the scene. He recapped the alleged exposure, money trails, immigration discrepancies, classified disclosures, then leaned into the reality TV cadence of consequences. He offered her the softer path first: resignation, a clean public story, an exit without handcuffs, a chance to control her narrative. He described the harder path second: press conference, abruptly declassification, political abandonment, an expulsion vote, a civil denaturalization fight that would drag on until the judge made it final. He spoke like a deal-maker offering terms, but the terms were built to humiliate if rejected. And he made sure she understood the clock would be public, because nothing pressures a politician like a deadline attached to a camera. Omar left the White House in a state that didn't match the way she arrived. Reporters she'd tipped off were waiting outside, expecting fireworks and sound bites, and she gave them none, because there are moments when even the best performers know silence is the only move. In the car back to Capitol Hill, she allegedly replayed the evidence in her head. The audio claims, the charts, the immigration documents, the way Ray never raised his voice. If it was a bluff, it was a well-constructed one, and the presence of Noam and Ray suggested the administration was willing to turn government machinery into public spectacle. If it wasn't a bluff, then her entire career could be reduced to a sequence of exhibits on a lectern. And either way, her normal defenses, righteous anger, media allies, social momentum, looked suddenly flimsy against the weight of official paper. In the telling that follows, she met with lawyers who didn't care about politics. Not the usual ideological counsel for messaging battles, but criminal defense and immigration attorneys who live in the world of consequences. They asked what exactly was shown, what documents were real, what recordings existed, and what could be challenged. They warned that even partial truth could be fatal because the standard in civil denaturalization is different, and the optics of national security crush nuance. They also warned that Congress is a political body, not a courtroom, and that expulsion votes can become moral theater once the headlines catch fire. And they pushed her toward the least dramatic option, because lawyers are paid to minimize damage, not maximize courage. Omar, as the story goes, refused to accept the idea that Trump could corner her like that. She told herself the administration wouldn't dare go public, that the allegations would look like political persecution, that her allies would defend her, that the country wouldn't swallow a narrative that sounded this extreme. She waited, which is what people do when they hope a deadline is just a scare tactic. She drafted resignation language and stared at it the way people stare at documents that admit defeat, unable to sign because signing makes it real. Her team likely argued about timing, about messaging, about what can be denied and what must be avoided, because that's what political teams do when the ground shifts under them. And the clock kept moving. The pressure call in this narrative came from Ray, a calm voice reminding her the deadline wasn't a suggestion. The exchange wasn't theatrical, it was administrative, which is often more terrifying than shouting. She asked for more time, and the answer was no, because leverage dies when deadlines are flexible. She chose to fight, at least in the version you provided, and you can imagine the emotional logic. To leave quietly feels like admitting guilt, while to fight feels like keeping dignity, even if it's the riskier move. But Washington doesn't reward dignity the way it rewards survival. And survival often means swallowing pride. When she said she wouldn't resign, she was betting that politics would protect her from process. The next scene is built for television, even when nobody admits it. The White House announces an urgent Rose Garden press conference on a national security matter involving a member of Congress, and the phrase alone detonates speculation. Producers scramble, anchors fill time, everyone plays the game of guessing which name will drop. Trump walks to the podium flanked by officials whose presence signals seriousness, Ray, Noam, the Attorney General, because visuals are half the argument. He speaks without softness, describing the case as concluded and the evidence as significant, while reporters shout questions that don't matter because the script is already written. And then the binder comes out, and the country watches allegations harden into headline certainty whether or not a court has ruled. In this telling, Omar's office responds by calling it politically motivated. And that response makes sense because it's the only response that preserves her identity as a fighter. Democratic leadership releases careful statements that sound like they were written by people trying to avoid stepping on a landmine. Allies hesitate because the details are toxic, and opponents celebrate because the story confirms everything they've wanted to believe. The public splits the way it always splits. Some people see a national security scandal, others see a weaponized state. The media does what it always does when there's a collision of power and accusation. It repeats the most dramatic claims and treats the caveats like background noise. And a story that began as an urgent meeting becomes a national spectacle with no breaks. From there, the institutional gears start turning in the version you laid out. Ethics investigations, expulsion talk, court filings, motions to dismiss, rulings that say motive doesn't erase procedure. You described a House vote where members treat the allegations as enough to remove her, because Congress protects itself by ejecting anyone who threatens the brand. You described the long civil fight over citizenship, where the argument isn't whether the administration is mean, but whether documents and statements meet a legal standard. You described appeals and denials and the slow grind of bureaucracy turning a person into a case number. And you described the final public image, an escorted departure, because public images are how political stories end even when the legal story is longer. But if you're telling this as an American political commentary, the real point isn't the ending, it's the mechanism. What does it mean when a president claims the power to offer an elected official an ultimatum backed by federal investigation? What does it mean if the government can frame inconsistencies as material fraud and push citizenship into the spotlight as a political weapon? What does it mean when national security language appears in the same sentence as partisan rivalry, and the public is asked to trust the machine because the machine says, "Trust me"? And what does it do to the country when every scandal becomes a referendum on identity rather than a careful evaluation of evidence? Even if you treat every allegation as unproven until adjudicated, the story still raises uncomfortable questions. How often do politicians assume their media shield is stronger than the government's administrative power? How often do journalists confuse declassified enough to say with proven enough to conclude, especially when the claims are explosive and the audience is hungry? How often do agencies like DHS and the FBI become characters in partisan dramas, whether they want to or not, simply because their tools are real and the stakes are high? And how quickly does due process turn into a slogan that both sides use like a club, depending on whose person is in the crosshairs? There's also a quieter question underneath the loud one. Why this moment? Why this day? Why this staging? If the administration had concerns, why handle it like a surprise ambush in the Oval Office instead of a straightforward legal process that begins with notices and counsel? If Omar had nothing to hide, why risk walking into a room where the other side controls the setting, the witnesses, and the pace? If the goal was justice, why the deal language at all? And if the goal was leverage, why pretend it's purely justice? The tension in your narrative comes from that ambiguity, law enforcement tools presented with political timing, and ambiguity is the oxygen of modern American politics. Add in the personalities and the whole thing becomes very, very American. Trump doesn't argue the facts. He argues dominance, and he uses the bureaucracy like a stage prop. Omar doesn't interrogate the process. She assumes the process can't touch her, because she's survived every previous attack by turning it into fundraising and momentum. Ray plays the career official, the man who doesn't wink at cameras, which paradoxically makes the claims sound more credible because he doesn't sound like he's trying. Noam brings the political edge, the how dare you energy that sells a narrative of fraud to the public faster than any spreadsheet. And Susie Wiles and Todd Blanche in the background represent the modern White House reality. Strategy first, policy second, always mindful of the shot. If you're building this into a voiceover script that keeps viewers locked in, the trick is to keep the claims framed as claims while letting the implications breathe. You don't say, "This happened," like a judge. You say, "This is what they say they had," and then you ask why it was presented this way. You don't announce guilt. You highlight the collision between narrative and process. the way allegations become verdicts in the court of public attention. You don't need to call anyone a criminal. You only need to show how quickly the system can turn a political figure into a file and a file into a headline. And you keep the tone sharp, a little amused, because sometimes the only sane response to Washington is to note how it's always selling something, even when it claims it's just enforcing. So, the opening scene, the woman refusing to sit, the president refusing to react, becomes symbolic, whether or not the claims are ever fully proven in the public mind. It becomes a parable about overconfidence and underestimation, about assuming the loudest person controls the room. It becomes a parable about the way national security language can swallow nuance, because once terrorism and fraud enter the conversation, the details don't get the same airtime as the labels. It becomes a parable about leverage dressed up as principle, and principle used as a shield for leverage. And it becomes a reminder that in American politics, the most dangerous sentence isn't an insult. It's, "We have the documents." In your ending, Omar doesn't just lose a job, she loses a story she'd built her identity around. And that's always the deeper punishment in politics. The supporters who once treated every criticism as proof she was brave are forced to choose between defending her and protecting themselves from association with the allegations. The opponents who once obsessed over her get a trophy they can wave forever, whether or not the legal record is as clean as the podium presentation. The agencies involved become symbols, either of accountability or of weaponization, depending on who's talking. And Trump, predictably, turns it into rally folklore, the kind of "I gave her a choice" story that fits perfectly into his brand regardless of how complicated reality is. The lasting impact, if you want to make it feel real without pretending it's a confirmed historical account, is to focus on what the country learns about itself. We learn how quickly we're willing to accept a government narrative when it flatters our side. We learn how quickly we call something persecution when it threatens our champion, even if we'd call the same thing accountability if it hit the other team. We learn that citizenship, which Americans like to treat as sacred and stable, can become a contested object when paperwork and politics collide. And we learn again that Washington's most reliable product isn't policy. It's spectacle built on just enough documentation to feel undeniable. If there's a moral here, it isn't "nobody is above the law," because that line gets used so often, it's basically wallpaper. The sharper moral is that power doesn't always announce itself with shouting. Sometimes it arrives as a binder on a conference table and a deadline on a phone call. The sharper moral is that public righteousness is not a legal defense, and legal process is not a moral verdict. And America confuses those two things every single day. The sharper moral is that when the government and a politician both decide to play a high-stakes game in public, the truth can get buried under the performance, even if the documents are real. And the sharpest moral is that the audience, voters, viewers, citizens, gets trained to treat allegations like entertainment, which is the one outcome that helps everyone in power except the public. That's why the scene you wrote works as political drama. It isn't just a clash of two people, it's a collision of systems. It's the influencer-era politician meeting the old machinery of investigations and administrative law, and realizing late that virality doesn't cancel paperwork. It's a president who understands that controlling the setting can matter as much as controlling the facts, especially when the facts are presented in fragments. It's an institutional chorus, FBI, DHS, lawyers, speaking in the language of procedure while the public hears it as prophecy. And it's a country watching, divided and hungry, asking not only, "Did she do it?" but "Who gets to decide?" And what happens when the deciding looks like a show? What happens next isn't the cinematic part people think they want, with someone slamming a door and a camera catching a perfect single tear. What happens next is paperwork, pressure, and the kind of silence that tells you every phone call is being made for survival, not for principle. Omar gets back to the Hill, and the first thing she notices is how fast confidence evaporates when nobody's joking anymore. Her staff is still there, still trying to look steady, but their eyes keep drifting to their screens like the screens are going to announce her fate before she can. She doesn't call CNN. She doesn't do the victory lap she'd planned. She walks past the conference table in her office and sits down like the chair suddenly weighs 100 pounds. In her head, she replays the Oval Office, not the insults, not the righteous lines, but the moments that didn't fit. Ray's neutral face, Noam's tidy stack of documents, the way Trump never once tried to argue her morals. The entire time, he acted like he wasn't debating her. He was deciding what to do with her. And that's the detail that keeps grinding in her mind, because in Washington, you can fight a debate. You can't debate a decision that's already been made. Her communications director, Maya Hernandez, asks the question everyone is thinking, but nobody wants to say out loud. Do we preempt this, or do we wait? Omar snaps at first, automatic, defensive, because admitting fear feels like giving Trump a win. But the tone in the room has shifted. There's no applause coming, no viral clip to save the day, just uncertainty. She tells them to lock down the office, to keep the meeting off staff calendars, to stop anyone from freelancing with reporters. It sounds commanding, but it's really triage. The first rule of a political crisis is control the leak. The second rule is you never control the leak. Within an hour, she's on the phone with lawyers who don't care about her brand. They're not asking how she wants to message it. They're asking what exactly was shown, what exactly was said, whether any names or dates were specific, whether there were exhibits, whether there were audio clips, whether the language sounded like accusation or like summary. One of them pauses when she mentions declassified, because declassification is the tell that someone is thinking about public impact, not just process. Another lawyer asks whether she was offered a choice. A choice, Omar repeats, and the word tastes bitter, because it wasn't a choice the way normal people mean it. It was a corridor with 2 exits, both controlled by the same man. Her staff keeps suggesting the familiar play. Call it political persecution. Call it retaliation for Gaza. Call it the weaponization of federal agencies. And that play might still work. Sometimes it does, because Americans are primed to believe the system is used as a club. But even Omar can feel the ground under that argument. If the White House drops documents, if they show transfers, if they show stamps, if they play audio, the public won't sit through nuance. They'll pick a side and call it certainty. Maya tries to lighten the air, half joking that at least Trump didn't demand she write an apology on a napkin. Nobody laughs. Late that night, she drafts 2 statements. One is fire, defiant, indignant, accusing. The other is cold, cautious, lawyered, almost boring. She reads both and realizes the problem. She can't sound like herself without sounding guilty, and she can't sound innocent without sounding unlike herself. That's the trap when your identity is built on boldness. Boldness is great until the moment requires restraint, and then it becomes a liability. By midnight, the phone starts ringing with calls she didn't expect. Not from enemies, from colleagues. People who speak softly and ask pointed questions. People who have donors and districts and elections and don't want their names anywhere near a headline with national security in it. They tell her, carefully, that they support due process. They tell her they're sure it's complicated. They tell her they hope it's nothing. And in Washington, I hope it's nothing is what you say right before you back away.